Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam. I'm sorry I've been away, but as usual working on my own music, but I'm back, and today we're going to rank and review the studio output by legendary Americana pioneers, the band. Now, the band formed in Toronto, Canada in 1957. They consisted of four Canadians: Rick Danko on bass and vocals, Garth Hudson on organ, Richard Manuel, multi-instrumentalist and vocalist, Robbie Robertson on guitar and vocals, and the only American Levon Helm on drums and vocals. They were originally known as the Hawks, and they were the backing band for Canadian rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins, before they jumped ship in the 60s and famously became Bob Dylan's backing band. Whilst working with Dylan, they became known as the band, going on to make 7 studio albums with the classic lineup, 2 live albums, and 3 records with Dylan, including a live album. Now, there were sort of ins and outs regarding the lineup, particularly in the early days, but I'm keeping it clean. I'm just looking at the releases made by the classic lineup I mentioned earlier. And they did reform in 1983 to make 3 more albums, but these were without Robbie Robertson. And then in 1986, Richard Manuel tragically committed suicide. So I'm not including any of those in my list, but I am including one very special Dylan album that they're co-credited with. There's a certain mythology, I think, around the band. Certainly a lot of that is down to the stunning in-concert film The Last Waltz that they made in 1976 with Martin Scorsese. But, you know, there's no denying the power of their music or the influence they've had upon generation of acoustic guitar strumming, pump organ playing, fiddled up bands and singers who've tried to mash up sort of folk, blues, country and soul ever since. And they're adored by critics, and they have been cited by many people as one of the most influential bands of all time. Even at the time, they were regarded as a bit special. They were revered by their contemporaries like David Crosby, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Elton John, Pink Floyd, Grateful Dead, and particularly superstar Eric Clapton, who so loved their communal approach to making music that he withdrew from the guitar hero status for pretty much the rest of his career and proceeded to make a run of albums that tried to capture the band's spirit and style. Now, I love the band, and some of their music I find very moving and powerful, but how many essential records did they actually make? Well, let's find out and crack into it. And number 8, I'm going to put from 1973, their 6th album, Moondog Matinee. On paper, this must have sounded like a great idea. The legendary band decides to do an album of covers that they used to play thousands of times in their formative years. And it should have been great, but in truth, this is an album masking some serious writer's block and issues behind the scenes. Their last album of new material was 2 years earlier, which in those days was a long time. And it wasn't a huge success. And they'd even released the live album, Rock of Ages, to plug the gap. But they include here tracks that they were really well known for, things like Elvis's Mystery Train. They've got a version of Sister Rosetta Tharpe's Didn't It Rain, amongst more unusual material like the Third Man theme. But it just doesn't have any of the bite or excitement you'd expect or want from a band covers album. It's not what you know they were capable of delivering. The sound here is flat, the tracks are overplayed, and there's a sort of meandering extemporization on a lot of it that just adds nothing at all. Covers albums can be dodgy at the best of times, but the best ones, like Bowie's Pin-Ups, which also came out in 1973, can be thrilling, and sadly, this is no Pin-Ups. At number 7, I'm going to put their 7th and final studio album from 1977, Islands. The story behind this album is a little bit depressing. The band had by now retired from life on the road, and they'd retreated to their infamous Shangri-La studios in Malibu to indulge in all kinds of sin and vice, and occasionally making a little bit of music, but not very much music of note was being made. Now, they'd already filmed The Last Waltz a year earlier in 1976 as their goodbye from the road, and they wanted to release that soundtrack on Warner Brothers rather than the label they were on, Capitol. So they regrouped this one last time to make Islands as an album to fulfill their contractual obligations to Capitol Records, so that Warner's could have The Last Waltz. And it really does sound like a contractual obligation record. It's really just a collection of old unused songs and newer songs that had yet to find a home, and it just sounds exactly like that. It's not that it sounds messy or disjointed. It's just clear that these tracks were left homeless for a reason, and it's all a bit flat in sound and songwriting. That said, Richard Manuel sings a beautiful Georgia on My Mind, and there are far worse Christmas songs than Christmas Must Be Tonight. Yes, there is a banned Christmas song out there. Go and find it. At number 6, I'm going to put their fourth album from 1971, Cahoots. Now, this album followed Stage Fright, and by now the band was sort of beginning to indulge a little bit in nefarious proclivities. And those sort of started to take hold a little bit, and it's where the band narrative gets a bit murky now, because some say that Robbie Robertson was trying to take over the band and was beginning to exert too much control. His defenders would claim he was just trying to keep the ship afloat, and really was the only member straight enough to do that. Either way, it's the music that suffers. And again, not that this is a bad album. It opens with The Great Life is a Carnival and has a fine cover of Dylan's When I Paint My Masterpiece. Van Morrison co-writes and contributes guests on 4% Pantomime. But I think Rolling Stone said it perfectly when they said the album is tinged with extinction. And I think compared to the music we'd had just a year earlier, it was clear that the magic the band could conjure up between themselves was beginning to sort of dissipate away. It's not a terrible record at all. It's listenable, but it's quite slow and it's quite somber. And I think the dark, murky front cover artwork reflects that quite well. At number 5, I'm going to put their sixth album from 1975, Northern Lights, Southern Cross. By 1975, the band had decided they wanted to retire from touring and build their own studio to escape to and just make music in, much like the Beatles had done with Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road 8 years before. And the result is this kind of legendary studio, Shangri-La in Malibu, which is actually still going today and is now owned by record producer Rick Rubin. And the first record they made at Shangri-La was Northern Lights, Southern Cross. And this album is kind of heralded by some as kind of the band's mini rebirth. They'd just been working with Dylan solidly. They'd done Planet Waves and they'd released the Basement Tapes. And that project seemed to give them a new lease of life. Here, Robbie Robertson writes all the songs, and I have to say it's a bit of a home run that nobody expected at the time. Forbidden Fruit, Ophelia, Acadian Driftwood, they're all great band songs. But the album's centerpiece is unquestionably It Makes No Difference, which is not just one of the great band songs, but I think one of the greatest songs ever written, certainly about love and loss. The version here is fantastic, but the live version on The Last Waltz is, in my opinion, my humble opinion, one of the greatest live performances ever captured on film. If you don't believe me, pause this now, go and find it, check it out, come back and tell me if you think I'm wrong. It's incredibly powerful. This was the first album they recorded on 24-track tape. So there's a lot of overdubbing, which the band wasn't known or loved for. You know, they were known for sort of getting in a huddle and making music as a group of people. Into, you know, the sort of the instruments intertwining and playing off each other. But the critics still really liked the album, and with the Last Waltz concert a year later, the band were on the surface at least back, and their cylinders were all firing. And Levon Helm, who's had a very fractious relationship with Robbie Robertson over the years, even graciously called this their best release since their second album. At number 4, we're going to take a slight detour because I'm going to put their 1975 release, The Basement Tapes, which was the second album they had made with Bob Dylan following 1974's very fine Planet Waves. but that was credited with to just Bob Dylan, with only Bob Dylan's songs. Here the star billing is shared with 7 of the songs coming from the band, so it makes my list. Now, this album was actually recorded in 1967. It took 8 years for it to be released, and it had been bootlegged very famously as an album called The Great White Wonder for many years, but it was finally officially released in 75. The band had begun recording at Dylan's place in Woodstock, but they moved to the band's place called Big Pink. And the result is one of those sprawling double albums full of curios and odds and ends. And appropriately enough, Odds and Ends is the name of the opening song. But the sound here is really, really great. It's that raw, untreated noise of a garage band playing together, which just adds that thrilling element of music going straight to tape. They recorded it very quietly in a huddle, and the general rule was that if you couldn't hear the vocal, then you were playing too loud. And the songs are also, they're very short and snappy, and the album's full of cracking little sort of, vignette moments. The most famous track on here is probably the Bob Dylan, Rick Danko co-write This Wheel's on Fire, which first appeared on Music from Big Pink, but was covered by Julie Driscoll, the Byrds, Susie and the Banshees, the Hollies, even Kylie Minogue has done a version of This Wheel's on Fire. It's an odd one in the canon of both Dylan and the band, and it's not for everybody, but I think it's unique, and I think it's very rewarding if you can buy into the vibe. So that takes us to the top 3, and at number 3 I'm going to put their third album from 1970, Stage Fright. By the third album, the drugs and drink were becoming an issue within the band, but they had wanted to produce themselves for a while, but they felt an experienced engineer on board would help kind of hold the whole project together. So enter no less than Todd Rundgren from Utopia. His presence, though, adds a sort of slightly anxious and unsettled vibe to the whole recording sessions. And the album actually has a darker, slightly more rock-oriented tone than the previous 2 albums. That said, I don't think there's any real drop-off in songwriting quality. Pretty much every song here is very, very fine, particularly Stage Fright, The Shape I'm In, which is stone cold band classics. But other songs like Time to Kill, Strawberry Wine, Sleeping, they're all really, really good as well. At the time, the critics were mixed, though. I think they mixed the Americana references and some of the more fiery playing of the first 2 albums, though it has been reappraised since, quite favourably, and it did get to number 5 on the charts, which was higher than either of the previous 2 albums. And it is one of only 3 band albums to sell over 500,000 copies. So, the top 2 band albums, I'm sure you know what they are. At number 2, I'm going to put from 1968, their debut album, Music from Big Pink. The band had made, but not released, the Basement Tapes with Bob Dylan, and they felt it was time to sort of step out of his shadow, so they retreated to Big Pink, so called because it's big house in upstate New York with a great big pink facade painted. The front wall is painted pink. You can see it. You can go online and see it. It's still pink to this day. And they began writing there, but were known because they'd left Ronnie Hawkins, so they weren't the Hawks anymore, and they were known as Bob Dylan's backing band. But this soon became shortened to the band, and such is how they got their name. The whole album was written at Big Pink, but it was recorded between New York and LA with producer John Simon, who'd worked with Simon and Garfunkel, Gordon Lightfoot, Leonard Cohen, and with cover artwork by Bob Dylan himself. This album kind of helped perpetuate the band myth from day one. It was recorded live with no overdubbing. It was very clear that these very, very seasoned road musicians, because remember they started in 1957, they had a touch of magic about the songs they made and played together. Here you've got Tears of Rage, Chest Fever, Dylan cover of I Shall Be Released, Dylan and Danko co-write This Wheel's on Fire, makes its first appearance here, but the crowning glory on this album is unquestionably The Wait, Robbie Robertson's magnificent hymn to the American South, which is a place that has a mythology all of its own, and the band drew liberally and almost exploitatively going to great pains to use the imagery and the mythology from the Deep South in their clothes, their music, their approach to music, and being a band as a community of musicians. But more of that shortly. Listening to this album again very recent, this week, just to do this list, I was struck by how sort of slow paced it was. It doesn't quite have the attack and bite that I remembered, but I still enjoyed it very, very much. Roger Waters called this the second most influential album of all time after Sgt. Pepper in the history of music. You know, and many people feel that it's the album that spawned the entire Americana genre. Rolling Stone put it number 34 on their list of greatest albums of all time. But the number one band of all time, the number one band of all time, no, the number one band album of all time. Should we do the best band of all time one day? Oh, I get hate letters. The number one band album of all time is their second album, The Band, from 1969, also known as the Brown Album. This is the record that takes the American mythology I was just talking about, this imagery and everything the band had toyed with on their debut, and it turns it into a fully fledged concept. And this is really where it all came together for the group. Image-wise, there's a very, very potent, you can almost smell the atmosphere from the album cover and the music inside. But also the sound is stronger, the playing is more upbeat than the debut. And Robbie Robertson was really starting to take a great, great interest in production and learning at a rapid pace from John Simon, to the degree that more or less he went on to produce all the band's subsequent albums. But it's the strengths of the songs here that really, really impresses. It's like a best of the band on one album, particularly on side one. Across the Great Divide, Rag Mama Rag, Up on Cripple Creek, King Harvest, Unfaithful Servant, and the towering, utterly magnificent The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. Not long after this, they became the first band after the Beatles to be featured on the cover of Time magazine. And in accolades and critical respect, the band was sitting very, very near the top of the tree at this point, if not in record sales. Number 45 on Rolling Stone's greatest albums of all time. And like so many of my top albums, it's in the Library of Congress as an item of cultural and artistic significance. Of course it is. So that's my list of band studio albums. I mean, away from the studio output, they made a rather sort of muddy sounding live album called Rock of Ages. But I think their best live stuff is on Before the Flood, which is a brilliant live album they made with Bob Dylan, which has them playing all the way through with Dylan, apart from Dylan's acoustic section. So there's two whole albums of band music there. And then, of course, there's The Last Waltz soundtrack featuring a host of the great and even greater from the rock world at the time. I mean, it's an essential album, The Last Waltz, and video as well for anyone with an interest in rock music of the 60s and 70s. And I think overall, for you band beginners out there, it's really the top two albums you need here, plus The Last Waltz and maybe even Before the Flood. Robbie Robertson left the band in 1978 after The Last Waltz, and for a long time he and the surviving members carried on a rather sort of depressing spat with each other, with the others accusing Robbie Robertson of trying to control the band's legacy and rewrite the story, placing himself very much at the centre of it as the key figure. That may or may not be true. I mean, sadly, Levon Helm and Rick Danko both died before any kind of reconciliation was made, and that's very sad considering how tight the band all seemed at one point. On a more positive note, it does seem that the last surviving member alongside Robbie Robertson, Garth Hudson, who's now 85, and Robbie Robertson seem to be on good terms again. Well, there we go. That's my rundown of the band, one of the great the great Americana band, probably, of them all. But I'll be back again very soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.